I think one of the traits that I love the most about founders is the combination of like the earned secret with what I call like the being almost like a historian of the industry, and that's exceptionally difficult to find. I would say like out of 200 founders, maybe one like has good answers to this, and then you combine that with like actually having the grit, the relentlessness, and the other traits that I think we all look for. I think is like, man, like it's definitely like less than 1 in 100.
Thanks for coming on the pod.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great having you, and good to meet you here in Austin.
For sure.
And thanks to our friends at the Bitcoin Commons for the sweet space. So you're standing up your new firm, not just a fund, but new firm, Ravelin Cap. Why don't you tell us what you're doing with that and what the idea behind it was?
For sure. I mean, Ravelin is an early stage firm focused on what I'm defining as critical software. So software first companies building critical industries. I would say that roughly means two things. One is straight up software companies that are going after hard industries, right? It's not just, software, the traditional startups selling to startups, but more things like manufacturing, aerospace, defense, national security, industrials, energy, all of those sectors that actually represent 80% of the global economy, but they have traditionally not been touched by technology. And then the second piece would be the companies that are actually, hardware companies or companies that are building the real world, but that are being transformed by software, right? I don't think I'm saying anything new here. I think that if you just look at the historical examples, right? Tesla, Enduro, even SpaceX, right? Like, SpaceX is a rocket company, but the reality is SpaceX built all of its own software internally, and they use almost nothing else. They built their own ERP system, right? And I think that, the way to get $100 billion plus outcomes is actually to build companies like that. So I would say like those are higher risk, higher returns. I think that, other than, the FANGs of the world, you would almost be hard pressed to find straight up software companies that are worth over $100 billion, right? I think you can think of like Salesforce, Uber, but it's actually pretty hard to think of other examples. So I think that the way to build the most giant companies is actually that intersection.
Yeah. What brought you to that piece of the market? What pushed you into hard tech and infra and all that?
Yeah, it's funny. I think to me is a different answer than most. It's not like I got a PhD. It's not like I built one of those companies before, but I am an immigrant. Like and we can get more into this, but in many ways, like the story of my life is a story of uprooting my own life and then my parents' life to actually move to this country and want to come here and build a life in America and believe in the American dream. So it is very important to me to actually make sure that America, the promise of America, remains true, and that America stays at the top. And I don't mean this in the the American empire has to be the number one. It's just like, look, like I do think that America has the best system of government, the best economic system in the history of humanity, period. And preserving that is really important to me. And I think the way to preserve that, I think that technology plays a very important role in that. And I think that building technologies, building companies that can make sure that system stays the way it was meant to be is something that has always been very important in my life.
Mm-hmm. So why start your own fund as opposed to join, or your own firm rather, and fund, as opposed to join another one? Was there a particular set of circumstances or criteria in a good way that made you think now's the time for me to strike out on my own?
Well, I'll answer the timing question first. I think the timing is somewhat of an easy answer. That when I started the firm about 9 months ago in the summer of last year, if you remember, I think that was the absolute bottom of the venture market. It was the absolute absolutely the grimmest time to be in the industry, at least of the last like probably a decade or so.
Sure.
And I think that's a cliche, but I think that, you know, taking a risk at that point in time is usually like, you know, the best time to get started, right? So I had the conviction that I really wanted to do something. We can get into this, but like my background, my way into venture was always just breaking through the walls and, you know, just figuring things out myself. You know, I raised a venture fund when I was in college. You know, right out of school, like I had to get a job to get my visa, but then I started a syndicate and continued to invest. And then I spent 3 years at a venture firm, which, you know, I had a great experience, but the reality is that was the anomaly in a way, right? Like, because even though I had a great time there, I really did miss like just the hustle and a little bit of like the entrepreneurial bug of like, you know, even though I'm not founding a company, I am doing something on my own. And that's something I've always wanted to do.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I resonate with that. Starting our own firm and fund on the VC side and you're founding, it's not quite like a startup, but there is something that you're creating something new out of nowhere. And
I mean, hey, your neck is on the line, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have to hustle. You have to really hustle. So yeah, I mean, let's talk about the fact. So you grew up in Brazil. When did you move to the US and why?
Yeah. Well, look, I moved here when I was 18. And I actually told my parents when I was 12 that I was going to find a way in and I was never going to go back. And that's exactly what I did.
Breaking through walls, as you said, yeah.
And, you know, for me, look, I actually don't harbor that many negative feelings about Brazil now. I certainly did when I was younger. Like, I hated Brazil. And the reason why I hated Brazil is that, like, you know, funny enough, like the president of Brazil today is the same president of Brazil over 20 years ago that I remember as a kid. And, you know, Brazil is very much, like economically at least, a socialist country. It aspired to be, you know, like a great socialist country. The North Star of Brazil when I was a kid was to be the next Venezuela, not the next United States. And some of my first memories are, you know, Lula shaking hands with the president of Brazil, shaking hands with Hugo Chavez, right? Like that was the idol of you know, not only the political elite, but of, you know, most of, you know, Brazilians at the time. I was very fortunate, like the way that I kind of broke out of that at a very young age. It really wasn't through school, right? Like as a matter of fact, I would say like.
Did you go to a public school?
No, no. I was fortunate that even though I grew up in a middle class family, I was fortunate that my parents sent me to a private school, which I would say like most people in Brazil do. Like private schools in Brazil are not as expensive as in the US. But even then, like I would say like 70 to 80% of all the teachers that I had growing up were like card-carrying communists. And so that was very hard for me because like you know, I grew up in a family, like my grandfather was very influential on me. You know, the early conversations I had with him, like still like when I was like 10 years old, it was, you know, talking about Milton Friedman, talking about Churchill, talking about Margaret Thatcher. And I just caught that bug. And I also had a personality that like, even though I think that like, to be fair, like I didn't necessarily know what I was getting into that much. It was very adversarial to what the teachers were teaching, and I think that made me even more excited about it. Yeah. But that led me down a path. I actually see some of the books here. You know, like Mises's Human Action, Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and I read those books when I was like 13, and those things were like very, very influential to me, and. Look, to be clear, I wasn't alone in that. I was a little bit early, but there was actually like a huge kind of like anti-government / libertarian movement in Brazil. That started probably about like 15 years ago at this point. And you can see, I mean, you guys probably saw the thing that turned into a meme, like a Brazilian box fighter, that, you know, after the fight, he grabbed the mic and he was like, study the Austrian economy, the Austrian economics.
Yes.
And
It was awesome. Yeah.
right. But people were like, oh my God, like what is this? Well, it's like, look, like it was actually like a pretty big thing in the country for a while, right? Like it was Brazil is a very online economy, which I think is something that most people don't know. Like Brazil is actually I think the second biggest Brazilians are the second biggest users of social media in the world after the Philippines. The US is like the 25th.
Philippines is the first?
Yeah.
Incredible.
So it was a very online economy. I was part of the first generation that grew up with that. So there was an aspect of that I just dug my own rabbit holes, right? And like, we're sitting kind of in the Bitcoin commons, right? So one of my memories growing up is I learned about Ron Paul when he was running for his first election, 2008.
Okay.
And at that point, I must have been like 12 to 13, something like that. Basically, I fell in love with it, like in the Fed, right? I had the Brazilian version of the book, the Portuguese version of the book. I really, that made a huge impact on me. And I got very passionate about those things, like before I even knew what tech was, right? So some of my memories is like I used to leave my computer mining Bitcoin up at night. And then my dad would storm into the room and say like, why the hell are you doing this? Like, you don't pay for the energy of this house. Like, just turn the shit off. And I'm one of the few idiots that like got into Bitcoin like almost like 15 years ago and didn't make like life-changing money out of it because I was like not old enough to actually like make like a significant bet on it. But that was the path that led me here.
That was your instinct to be early and like explore and.
Well, I would say for sure that I aspirationally yes, but I would say like most importantly, it is the thing that those are the things that led me to believe in the promise of this country and believe in many of the ideas that I think got us to where we are today.
Yeah. That's awesome. So you moved here when you were 18. Where did you go to school?
So Brazil went through the worst economic recession of its history.
Okay.
In the early 2010s. It was pretty grim. I wasn't here for the Great Recession in 2008. But the economy of Brazil went down. Like the GDP went down 20% within like 12 to 18 months. Wow. It was really dark. It was like you walk into the streets and every single store is closed. So like I said, I grew up in like what was a lower middle class family. My parents did relatively well when I was growing up. Like we did like 2 trips to the US. It was great. And then that happened and everything went. So they got on the brink of losing everything. And I told them, I was like, hey, like I'm not applying to any schools in Brazil. I have no idea how we're going to afford school in the US because it's very expensive, especially for international students. But I'm just going all in. Like I'm just going to be so unhappy if I go to school here. It's just not for me. So I applied to a bunch of schools in the US. I got very fortunate to get a full ride to go to college in Minneapolis, of all places, University of Minnesota. I had never heard of Minnesota. I had never even seen snow. But hey, like it was my ticket to America, right? Like it was like my way into the country.
I think the first time you and I met, we commiserated over that because I lived outside of Minneapolis for 18 months before moving to Texas. And I had never, I knew, of course, Minneapolis, but I had never been to Minneapolis.
Right.
It was a very different experience than I expected.
Right. And Minnesota is a interesting place. So my wife's family is from North Dakota, like from Fargo, so like basically
right
Minnesota.
There.
Yeah. And one of the things I didn't know is that, look, first of all, like wonderful place. I mean that sadly has gotten significantly worse after 2020 and everything. But it's a very insular economy, like very, very wealthy in many ways. But I think the statistics is like 82% of students that go through the University of Minnesota stay in Minnesota, which if you just go to the other U of M, University of Michigan, is like the opposite stat. So it was a very interesting experience for me. And I didn't necessarily know what I was getting myself into. But again, like I really didn't care. It was like, we couldn't afford anything. Like it was my way in. Like just don't ask questions, just go. And then I was very fortunate that, about a year later, my dad came with me. He was exploring some business opportunities, and then, fortunately kind of convinced my family my parents to kind of like take what they had and like take a bet on themselves and like, come here, build a business here, get a visa, do all the things the right way, but rebuild their lives in the United States. And they've been here for a decade now. My brother basically grew up here. So yeah, I mean, look, like I said, it's like on your question, like why you're passionate about these things. Well, it's like, it's in many ways like the believing in this promise is the story of my life, and protecting this is a very personal thing.
Yes, I totally resonate with that. I think Catherine Boyle, in one of her essays, I forget which one, maybe it's one of the ones on seriousness, all of which are really good. But in one of them, she makes a point that it's a small paragraph where she asks this question about why it is that sometimes immigrants make the best Americans, and it resonates with that kind of story where they choose deliberately to connect to and uphold and preserve the values that get the country to where it is today, as opposed to what you say in your manifesto, we'll get to that later, deliberately isolating or moving away from those things that kind of undergird the entire project.
Yeah, and you can understand something more, seeing it from the outside and get kind of the ethos of the place. Yeah. My favorite meme is there's one of a Japanese anime American with like a American flag bandana, and it's like, be the American that the Japanese think you are. And that's it. Like, seeing it from the outside, you're like, wow, America's great. And you can embrace that ethos and then actually drive it.
Yes.
Well, it's funny. I always hesitate, as I'm guessing maybe you as well, to like talk about, it's like, oh, immigrants make the best Americans. Is like,
sure.
it feels a little bit awkward to me to talk about those things, but like, it
has to be a very narrow set.
Correct. Right. But the idea that like you're just very personally attached to the principles that got the country to where it is today because of your own experience not having that growing up, I think is something that is undeniably true. I mean, at least in my experience.
Right. Sort of the deliberate assimilation to specific principles.
So it's funny. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, most people, like his famous quote is like the man in the arena.
Right.
But my favorite quote from him is, and I'll probably butcher, so I'm just paraphrasing, is, the biggest threat to America is hyphenated Americanism.
Yes.
And, some of the, and he's saying this, is some of the best Americans I know are actually born elsewhere, but there's no biggest threat to this country than, turning it into a squabbling of nationalities where everybody is not just American, they're Brazilian American, they're Italian American, they're Portuguese American, they're Somali American, whatever it may be. So, and this is actually something that has surprised me, of like just the evolution of the country over the last decade, call it 20 years, or it's just, I'm a big believer that like, immigration with assimilation is a requirement, right? And I don't think this is controversial. I think it became controversial maybe, like in the last like 5 or so years. Right. But I look, like if you come to this country, if you choose to abandon your past and if you're betting your whole life here, I think absolutely, like it should be an expectation that you're gonna adopt its ways, you're gonna adopt its culture, and I mean, look, it's like it's fine. Like if you want to keep some things with you, it's not like you gotta give up on like your food
pretend
and like whatever.
Sure.
That's totally fine. But like this idea that I think the most extreme version of it is like America is an economic zone, right? Is like you just come here, you plunder all the resources, you become rich, and like but hey, you go back to Brazil or you go back to India, right? It's like that's like pretty absurd to me. Is like the number one reason why America or any country for that matter should want immigrants. It's not just because like they're going to increase your GDP. Like screw that number. I'm sure that matters somewhere on the list, but it's like probably like number 10th after appreciation for the culture, after appreciation for the principles, after like the way of life, after how do you make like your community feel, how integrated do you get in that community, And I just feel like people completely lost the plot.
Yeah, now there's a funny dynamic where you do have, again, a specific subset, let's not generalize, but a specific subset of immigrants that come and they assimilate to these principles even as sort of native born, or let's call them heritage Americans, deliberately abandon these principles. And so a new wave of immigrants are sort of more American, more based, if you want, like more, they're holding on to these things more tightly than the people that have a history. It's just a funny dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I certainly agree with that. It's been my personal experience as well, like in Minnesota, in California, in other places, that it's just really easy to take for granted. If you're born around these things, right? That being said, like, not to be like anti-immigration, but I certainly think that like the type of immigrants that like have come to America in the last like few years, like it has definitely changed. And I think you can see this. And look, I saw this like even when I went to school in Minneapolis, right? Like Minneapolis has like a ton of immigrants from all over the world. And it's really insane to me. Like I'll put it into the context of something that's happening right now. It's like just walk through the campus of like university, like UT. I mean, see what's happening in Columbia, right? How many of the protests are actually like foreign born? It's like pretty crazy. And I think that like you've got to be like, there's like some degree of lack of self-awareness and arrogance for you to be born elsewhere, come into this country deliberately, and then, join the streets on a protest. That is something like, it's a degree of comfort that I would never understand.
High conviction bet.
Yeah,
that's true. That's very true. So kind of going back to your story. So when you were in school, when you were starting to invest, I guess all the way up to the present, what did you see that drove you towards your thesis for Ravelin? Because I think it's the right thesis, but was it a survey the landscape? Were you following your nose? How did you get to that point?
Yeah, well, look, not to be nitpicky, but I don't consider myself as a thesis-driven investor. And like it's the Steve Jobs thing that like the dots looking back like always look clearer, right? Like I would say like in the beginning I didn't know what I was doing. Like my way into venture was simple yet convoluted because I knew I wanted to do venture. And to give a little bit more color.
What did you study?
So I was about to touch on that. So my majors in college were finance, information systems, and entrepreneurial management.
Okay.
So I got to do a little bit of all the things, and I joke, like if you do a Venn diagram of those three things, I feel like venture is probably like one of the very few things that is like squarely in the center. I was very passionate about finance. Buffett, Munger, like these folks were like heroes of mine. I discovered very quickly that I didn't want to be a suit and like the type of like public investing and like Wall Street jobs like didn't really make sense for me. And I was really not excited about that. And then on the other hand, like I loved entrepreneurship. Richard Branson, like, his biography, Losing My Virginity, is one of my favorite books of all time. Like, like his entrepreneurial spirit is something that I read that book at a very young age, and like it's still like really resonates with me. It's very aspirational to me. But I also think that I have a degree of like, a monkey mind, that I'm just jumping from one thing to the other, like ADHD, that it's actually really hard to have if you want to be an entrepreneur. So I didn't necessarily have the things like, hey, like I want to, build this company and dedicate my life to this thing, which I think being like a life's work entrepreneur is like really important. And then on the other hand, like I was always very passionate about technology. To go back, like I was part of this first generation that grew up with social media, with iPhones. Some of my first memories is like learning English, playing like Warcraft with people from all over the world, right? Mm-hmm. So I kind of knew all of those things, and then I didn't know what venture was. Again, I was like freaking Minnesota, right? Like, but then I found out, and the minute I found out, I became like completely passionate about it. And it was actually, I'll tell you like a little bit of the longer version of the story, but like I was in 3 majors in college, but like I hated to be in classrooms, right? So I would take every opportunity I had to just like wander around, you know. So this is my junior year of college. I went to the bathroom one day and I just took like the longest route possible, you know, went up and down 3 floors. And one of my professors that I was very good friends with, who was the director of the Entrepreneurship Center, saw me that day and pulled me aside and was like, hey, like, you know, we kind of had this idea of like getting students kind of like close to venture. We don't really know what that looks like yet. But like, you should kind of take a look at this. Like, I think it could be a pretty good fit for you. And again, I had no idea what venture was. So I go deeper into it. And it's like, wait a second, like you can actually invest in like entrepreneurs, like at really early stages, be decently close to them and kind of like think about like these big things that are changing the world and hopefully make a dent on that. And like, I was pretty mesmerized by it. I was like starstruck. And what ended up happening is, you know, in my senior year of college, I took that concept of like, hey, like how can we get students closer to that ecosystem? And remember, right, like University of Minnesota, like we didn't have like Dorman Fund, we didn't have Rough Draft Ventures, we didn't have Contrary Capital, any of these things to get students close to venture. So I just fell in love with it. I took it upon myself, and on my senior year of college, I barely went to classes. Like my final semester of college, there was one class that I never even saw the professor, other than the day of the exams. And I spent all of the time fundraising for a student-run fund that was independent from the university, but was owned by the students. It's like we were literally GPs on the fund. We had carry on the fund. So I raised a little bit over $1 million for that from a bunch of individuals in Minnesota. We got a commitment from the university endowment. The endowment is not, you know, the students raised a second fund. The endowment's a big LP in the fund. And that was kind of my way into VC. And, you know, I graduated college. I moved to the Bay Area like 6 days after I graduated. I passed the fund onwards to the next generation of students. And I moved to the Bay Area, like literally knowing like 2 people. And what ended up happening is like I said, I had to go get a job in management consulting because I needed an H-1B visa. And look, I knew I was going to hate consulting from like day 0. But you know, number one thing, like as we were talking about, is like job number one, stay in the counter.
Yes, that's right.
So you know, was lucky to so went to work in consulting, and one of my mentors, like one of the 2 people I knew moving to the Bay Area, kind of said to me, he's like, hey, like you broke through the walls to you know, raise that fund, get you to where you are today. Like, don't wait for anybody to invite you in. Like, that's frankly not gonna happen, which was a pretty good reality check. I think he was right? Like, you know, most jobs in venture, even for junior investors, go to like, oh, you went to Stanford, or you know, like you worked at Stripe, right? Like whatever it is. And I didn't have any of those things, which in hindsight was a bit of a blessing. But it meant that I needed to like, again, break through the walls again. So he kind of, you know, showed me the ways a little bit, and I started the syndicate. And the insight was basically like, hey, like if you raise the money when you're like a nobody in college, just find good deals. Like find good deals, and you're just gonna figure out how to raise money for those deals. And that's what I started doing. So over the course of like the next like 2 years or so, I started to find good companies, investing in them, and build a track record of like 30-ish companies that I was pretty early to. You know, I was an early investor in like Superplastic, 8 Sleep. I put a personal check into Mercury. That's now a unicorn, and my wife actually works there. It did yeah,
okay,
yeah.
That's awesome.
It did a lot of these things, but like I was still working like 60 hours a week in consulting, right? Wow. So flying up to Seattle to work at Microsoft, et cetera, like it was pretty tough, but like again, like I had no alternative, right? So anyway,
that's awesome. And so, at what point do you go from syndicate to actually sort of entering venture as a
when I got my visa?
Okay.
And that was like roughly at the beginning of the pandemic, and basically I had already been investing for a couple of years, right? One of the things, it's a nuance that I feel like some people know about, many people don't. It's like I was under a work visa, right? Mm-hmm. When I do get my visa, so it means that I can be my own employer. So I do need to find a place that's gonna, like many like startups and venture firms, they won't sponsor your visa for you because it's a very costly process that more often than not doesn't work. But they will easily transfer your visa because that's a virtually a risk-free process. So when I did get my visa, I had already been in venture for a couple of years. I already had a track record, but I did want to, go and like learn the ropes of being inside of a firm. And at that point, this is in the beginning of the pandemic, if you remember. So I had done, and when you get your visa, there's a period that you need to wait to actually be able to transfer your visa to a different company. And exactly during that period, it was the very early months of the pandemic, I did On Deck, the fellowship that Eric Thornburg started. Yeah. So I got to know him. I did a few co-investments with his firm at the time. And then, when I was able to transfer my visa, at that point, I joined Village Global, which is the firm that Eric started. And it was there for a little bit under 3 years. Had a great time there. And that was, again, like the first opportunity that I had to actually be in venture full time. And one of the things I'm very grateful for, we can talk more about this, but like, I think that the average job of a junior investor in 80% plus venture firms like really sucks. It's like awful for a variety of reasons. But I'm very grateful for Village because one of the things that I did have is, like I worked in the industry for about 3 years before, and I had autonomy to I was doing my own thing, right? So losing that is something that I really didn't want to do. And Village did give me a lot of autonomy, a lot of independence to pound the table, to do my own deals, which is fairly unique. So I did that for 3 years, and then I got my green card. And then it's the story I told you about, like we're in the summer of last year, the venture industry sucks, but, thankfully the track record of the companies I have invested in served me very well. And I think we're only in the early innings of the upside that we're going to see from those companies. And I was like, you know what, like, I do know that if I have the opportunity to, I want to be in this industry for the next 30 plus years. Let's just take a bet on myself and let's see where that's going to go. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
What throughout this whole period, I mean, if you didn't know about venture, I'm curious about your parents. Did they have any idea what venture was? And you're trying to kind of keep them up to date? Like, so don't worry, I actually have a job.
Yeah. So my dad worked in the auto industry for most of his career. Okay. Now he manages a small business, and my mom was a psychologist. So no connection whatsoever. And again, remember, right? Like Brazil now has Nubank, and it has like a pretty interesting startup ecosystem, but like that was not a thing when I grew up there. Like it was unheard of.
Yeah. So totally new ecosystem.
Yeah. So you just alluded to this a little bit, but like defense and manufacturing has now gotten a lot more attractive. A lot more people are going into it. You're focused on a lot of infrastructure, energy, critical software. Where do you think we are in that? And the popularity of that space.
Yeah. I mean, look, I don't think I'm saying anything new here. Trey Stevens actually just wrote an essay yesterday, which you guys can link to the show, talking about how, the sheep mentality of the venture industry, and the moment that there's a category, right? Like the quote that I usually use, like the minute that there's a market map, it's too late. At least if you want to be in the business of like actually investing early. Right. So look, I think defense is exciting. I think that what Andrew built will become obviously like a truly world-changing company. But I am definitely skeptical of the hype, right? Like when I was very fortunate to invest in the first round of Hadrian, you could really count, I think, on the fingers of a hand, like how many credible investors would actually look at a company like that. And Chris Bauer, luckily, like actually got them all, right? Yes, and like I think at that point, this was like 2020, 2021. those, like, you look at that cap table, it's like those are literally like the only investors that would I think would invest in a company like this. And like now, it's like every firm is excited about the sector. It's you know, I don't want to name names, but you just look at like all the dinosaur firms that have been around for like 50+ years, like they're all investing actively in the sector. And look, to be clear, I think it's very exciting. I think that it's going to be good for the ecosystem. One of the challenges I think that some of these spaces have had is you could get the early stage investors, but then you had a valley of death on the funding side, because there's no growth investors that are actually excited about the sector. I think this is actively changing. That I think is very good. What I think is very bad is that you start to see, you know, the herd-like behavior of like not only the investors but also the founders that were like, oh, like I was excited about micromobility, then I got excited about Web3, then I got excited about AI, and now I'm excited about defense. And
pivot.
The signal to noise ratio is really hard. Is really hard to deal with. So at this point, like, to be transparent, I'm not sure I'm going to invest in any defense companies out of the fund. I haven't yet. It would have to be like very unique and controversial in some ways, I think, because I do think this is where the consensus is now. So the last companies I've invested in is you know, a lumber company, and I just got announced this week. It was a fishing and robotics company, right? So I'm much more excited about that. It's like
that one is in El Segundo, which is funny to me, right?
Well, yeah, it's a longer story, but the company actually got started in New York, and then they actually moved to California, and you know, recruited a lot of talent out of SpaceX and out of Andro. So it's very exciting, and like, you know, what is, like, again, I'm not a thesis driven investor, right? So like, if you ask me, I wouldn't be able to answer. It's like, oh, what are other categories that is, you know, that is like fishing, like lumber, that is giant, and you know, could be reinvented by technology. It's like, well, it's not my job to know, right? Like I don't have a crystal ball, but the one thing I can say is like the sheer number and the quality of the talent that is now excited about, you know, using the experiences that they got and, you know, really standing in the shoulder of giants like, you know, SpaceX, Andro, Palantir, Tesla, et cetera, and they're spinning out to go start companies in these sectors that we would not even think of. That is like the number one reason to be bullish on what we're seeing right now.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, fish robotics and lumber are not things that would show up on a market map, not things that people are probably talking about.
That's right.
Most of the VC firms. So not thesis driven, but what draws you to those companies then?
Yeah. Look, what I obsess over, and you know, I think the one thing that hopefully I have an edge on is really trying to understand like founders. Again, like, my mom was a psychologist, so I actually spend a lot, like, I'm very naturally drawn to that, and trying to understand like a person's motivations and their unique insight into building something. I'll give you an example. I was the first one to commit to this company called Traba, which is a labor marketplace for industrials, which is doing phenomenally well. Again, I think still very in the very early stages of their trajectory.
Earlier than Founders Fund?
Yeah. There's a story I don't want to share here, but the answer is yes. And at this point, they've raised, I think, about 50 million from Founders Fund in Kozla. You know, one of the things that you talk with Mike is, you know, I asked him, it's like, hey, like, this is a category that is traditionally known as like kind of a category because you have like Wonolo that raised like a ton of money from Sequoia. You have InstaWork that raised a ton of money from Benchmark and Greylock and a bunch of others. And I don't want to deem them as failures, but it's like, it has obviously not been to the success of like Uber and Lyft in some of these companies. So what are you going to do differently, right? It's like, because we can all think of like these categories are like, hey, like you raised a ton of money, tried, didn't work, and it's like, it just feels like something that like VC, like the traditional VC would just say, hey, like this doesn't work, right? So what is it different? And I think one of the traits that I love the most about founders is the combination of like the earned secret right? So Mike spent about, I think, 5+ years setting up all of the Uber cities in Latin America. So Mike actually lived in Brazil. He set up Uber for Rio, and he went like city after city, kind of like building that marketplace from scratch. So he understood a lot of the nuances of marketplaces in different locations, and how to go like do the 0 to 1. And he had like very unique insights as to like why labor marketplaces are different. If you're working for restaurants, if you're working for manufacturing, if you're working for like events, if you're doing like light industrials, and you know, here's why, like, you know, like they went after these things. They didn't realize specific nuances of the sectors, but you know, here's why this approach is gonna work. So it's a combination of the earned secret with what I call like the being almost like a historian of the industry. And that's exceptionally difficult to find. I would say like out of 200 founders, maybe one like has good answers to this. And then you combine that with like actually having the grit, the relentlessness, and the other traits that I think we all look for. I think is like, man, like it's definitely like less than 1 in 100. Right. Like the number is actually like, you know, 1 out of every few hundred. I don't want to say. I think Mike and actually are definitely like 1 out of 1,000+ founders. But like that may be like maybe the best team I've ever worked with. But I think, yeah, like those things are really and this is the difficulty of venture. I think it's something that is not talked about enough. Is that I think venture is one of the industries where the smart things to say, the things that sound smart to say are actually oftentimes really stupid, and the things that sound trite and sound simple are actually really important. And internalizing them is very few people are actually able to do it well. And I think, look, I've been in the industry for 5+ years at this point. I think that I'm still learning every day, like of like truly being able to learn those lessons. But yeah, you hear a lot of advice in the industry that, oh, this sounds so smart, right? And it's actually really stupid. So
yes, yeah. So on the LP side, for your LPs, like, why do you think they're kind of reversing some of the themes we're talking here? Lots of optionality for funds, and you know, you have a prospective LP, and they can look at, even in broadly speaking, there's the American Dynamists types, there's like Founders Fund, there's some other solo GP folks that are doing well and have done great work. What do you think makes LPs excited to work with you and with Ravelin? Yeah,
look, I don't want to speak for them, but I think that, you know, what I've seen so far, I think is the combination of my background, my story of like, you know, why am I doing this, combined with, I think, you know, hopefully it shows like breaking through all of those walls, combined with you know, a track record that it's still early, you know, like I it's not like I was the first investor in like Palantir or you know, even Andrew was founded in like, I think 2016, right? So I was in college at that point. But combined with you know, a track record of being, you know, early and oftentimes first in many of these, I think, that are going to be category defining companies, right? You know, first round of Hadrian, first round of Apex Space, first round of Traba, and many other companies, which I think that are going to do really well. And I hesitate to say this because I think that a lot of times it's mostly a bullshit metric. But I mean, just in I think the last 6 to 9 months ago, definitely since I started the fund, I've had like my prior investments raise nearly $300 million of follow-on capital.
Your prior was before you started the fund, yeah?
Correct.
Yeah,
correct.
So that's nice markup across.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, like I'm always hesitant because like I don't think that like raising money is like a good goal. Is like you're just selling your company. But I think it's like it just shows a little bit that like, hey, like these companies are really in the early stages of like hitting their stride, and I think that I'm decently confident in saying that I think we're going to see some of those companies become like pretty giant and pretty category defining in their respective sectors over the next 5 years for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. Do you hope to eventually build out a team, or do you gonna solo GP it for a while?
Look, it's we can get more into this. It's a little bit of venture inside baseball, but I have like a world of respect for Andreessen Horowitz, General Catalyst. I have many dear friends on those firms, but my version of success, and to be clear, I think venture is one of those industries that like there's several ways to be successful. But my version of success probably looks something more like, Ray Thompson did a caffeinated, Jeff Lewis did a Bedrock, or Samuel Shah did a Haystack. That are firms that are managing, decent amount of money, not, bloated billion-dollar funds, but at the same time, they've been able to keep like a very small team. Mm-hmm. This is going to be a little bit controversial, but I'm happy to stand by the statement. Like I think that like the average venture firm, if you fired half of the team, the returns would actually go up. So the traditional view that like you raise bigger funds and therefore you need to hire bigger teams, like I'm not really sure that makes sense to me. I think that, look, like the numbers show, right? Like it is really hard to be good at this job. Being good at this job consistently for 10 plus years, it's the numbers could not be more against you, right? Like we're talking about like 10% plus, as 10% less of all the people in the industry. Right. So if you have a shot at doing that, it's confusing to me why you would want to actually like expand your team. Right. Because it just seems to me that it just gets harder and harder that you're going to actually have the people that are going to be able to do that. Yeah. I think there's a somewhat of an inverse correlation with growing team sizes and returns. Now, I think there's ways to do that. I think, to steelman that argument, I think that the way they do that is you do a little bit of what A16Z has done, right? It's like you segment your team. Sure. So yeah, sure, you have a big team, but like the reality is like the Catherine's team is like very small. Like it's like 5 people max, right? Yes. So I think there's ways to do it, but then you get into other challenges, which can be exciting for some people, but it's just not for me, right? Like, I think that I'm not excited about managing people. Right. I think one of the things that doesn't get talked about enough is like the skills of being a VC are somewhat the opposite skills of being a good manager. Finding good VCs that are also good managers, they do exist. I don't think it's me. So those are all things that I'm still in the very early stages of thinking about.
Right. That makes sense. I was listening to a podcast with Keith Raboy yesterday, a very recent one, where he talks about what you said about growing team size and returns likely going down. He talked about it in terms of a power law. Everyone knows about the power law, and the power law certainly within venture, where you have 1 or 2 companies that return the whole fund. Well, he's saying there's sort of a power law within a power law where a very few number of people will drive those few companies that drive the whole fund. And so why would you grow your team? And he actually instinctively sort of thinks, his thesis is the bigger your team, the worse your returns will be.
Well, I mean, but I think even if you just look at it mathematically, right, exactly. I think you get to the same conclusion, right? It's like, what are the odds of anybody being a good investor? And then you look at it over time. If somebody's actually made some good investments, what are the odds that was skill versus luck? And then you need to look at it over a long period of time. And then I think you get to a very, very small percentage of people that can actually do that. And then if you just multiply that by like every person that you're adding, yes. you get to I think it's impossible to not. The odds just the odds just completely go against you.
Right. Yes, absolutely. So what's next for Ravelin? What are you doing right now? Are you still fundraising? Are you just deploying?
No, thankfully, I feel very blessed because the average fund one, I think if you look at the data, takes about 20 months to close. I've been able to do that in 9 to 10 So half of that time, even in, I think the data also shows like this is actually the hardest time to raise for a new fund in 20 years. So since the dot-com bubble, like even the great financial crisis, it was easier to raise money for a fund one than today.
Yeah, wow.
No, I feel very blessed to having been able to do that, count on the support of not just a lot of mentors and friends of mine, but a lot of, frankly, like heroes of mine in the industry that came in as LPs in this fund. But I'm just excited now to get back to work, get back to doing what I like to do most, which is, partnering with phenomenal founders, working in these hard industries at the earliest stages. And, I've been pretty actively investing. I just completed, I think, my 7th investment out of this fund. Can't wait to do that over and over again over the next, hopefully, 2+ years, and then continue to grow the fund for decades to come.
Awesome. Well, Lucas, thanks for coming on, man. This was awesome.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Good to have you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.